Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today I'm going to be doing a book tag. Now I don't usually do tags on my channel because I actually find them quite difficult to do. But Jason, over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, has created the Booktube Top 10s tag. Now Jason's channel is fantastic. I really like the books that he talks about on his channel, particularly the theological books he talks about. He's a relatively newer booktuber, but I feel like a lot of people already know who he is, because I've seen a number of people doing this tag, but I will link his channel below anyway. I think this is a great tag because I love thinking about my favorite books, and so this was a really fun exercise. I wrote it down in my notebook, and I'm going to share it with you today. So for this challenge, a booktuber just has to give their top 10, with number 1 being their favorite book of the list, and number 10 being their least favorite book of the list. So I will be also giving you the books in order, but in reverse order. So number 10 will still be my least favorite of the 10 books, and 1 will still be my favorite of the 10 books, but number 1 will be at the end of the video, and number 10 will be at the beginning of the video, if that makes sense. The goal of this tag is to create a Booktube Top 10s list. As the name of this tag suggests, Jason has a spreadsheet, I guess, where he enters people's top 10 favorite books, and then from that, he will determine what Booktube's top 10 favorite books are. I don't know how many of my books will end up on the list, but I really like this exercise. So number 10 is Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Hard Times is one of Dickens' shortest works. Probably Christmas Carol is the shortest of Dickens' works, but Hard Times, though short, is my favorite Dickens that I've ever read. It deals with the working class in industrial London. It is satirical, as all of Dickens' works are, but I felt that the characters are the most fleshed out. It is actually quite atmospheric in the way that the setting is described. And this was also the first Dickens work I read where the female characters weren't just pure angels. Like, they were really written well. I really like the way that Dickens wrote the female characters in this book. The beginning of the story talks about Mr. Gradgrind, who believes only in facts, and we get to see what that means and how his education influences the children that we follow in this story. Number 9 is a spiritual work. So I want to very briefly tell you my own spiritual tendencies, because there are 3 books on this list that are spiritual. So I'm Roman Catholic, and I'm particularly interested in Christology, and with a particular focus on the humanness of Jesus, even like the crucifix and the bodiedness of God. So that is certainly a perspective that is becoming less popular today, which is perfectly fine, but it's something that I relate to quite a bit. So anything that emphasizes the incarnation particularly appeals to me, as you will see with the 3 works on this list. So number 9 is Works of Love by Søren Kierkegaard. Often his name is pronounced incorrectly, Søren Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher who is often referred to as an existentialist. That's not necessarily the best term to use. He had issues with the Christianity of his time, and he wrote a number of works under these different pseudonyms, and the pseudonyms are like fictional characters that he has invented. The pseudonyms do not necessarily share his own personal views. And so it's a really interesting way of exploring his ideas. But he also, alongside these indirect works, in which he criticizes the Christianity of Denmark indirectly, he also has a number of direct spiritual works. And Works of Love is, in my opinion, his best work. Particularly the first half. Even though the second half was a little bit repetitive and a bit boring, the first half of Works of Love is so amazing that I cannot leave it off this list. I've read it so many times, and if you are interested in thinking about the humanness of Jesus and what that means for Christianity and discipleship, I definitely recommend Works of Love. It's very beautiful, and I think just very relevant today. I think, as always, any book on love has got to be relevant. Number 8 is a French work, Le Grand Meaulnes, or The Great Estate, by Alain-Fournier. The Great Estate is a young adult book. I don't read young adult very often, but it is YA. It follows Auguste Meaulnes, who is a high schooler. So the narrator of the book is a classmate, and he is the one who tells the story of Auguste Meaulnes, who chances on this mansion as he's running away from the school. He gets lost and he finds that there was supposed to be this wedding, and this wedding didn't work out, and there's this very fairy tale vibe to this story as we follow Auguste Meaulnes' coming of age, and consequently the narrator's coming of age. I think this is such a beautiful work because it really gets at the struggles of adolescence and the loneliness that is often felt by young people as they try to find themselves, as they try to understand love, and the responsibilities that come with that. I think The Great Estate is a fantastic classic, and it's great to see the other booktubers reading and reviewing this book. Number 7 is My Antonia by Willa Cather. Now, I have read 3 works by Willa Cather. I really love Death Comes for the Archbishop as well, but My Antonia definitely takes the cake. It is just this beautiful study of Antonia, a girl whom the narrator met. She is of Scandinavian descent, living in the United States, and we get to see things from his perspective. And I don't think that the narrator is entirely reliable. I find it interesting that the author, a woman, tells the story from the perspective of a man. And while some people find this to be distancing, I actually find this to be really a powerful commentary about even privilege and what we can know, when we are trying to understand somebody different, whose experiences are very different from our own. So number 6 is a book in the Bible, the Gospel of St. John, which in my opinion is the most incarnational of the 4 Gospels, despite the incarnation being the most pronounced in the Gospel of Luke. I like how John's Gospel emphasizes a lot Christology. It's known for having a high Christology, which means that the emphasis is on God becoming human, but I do find a lot of emphasis on the humanness of God as well, which is something I really like. It's very rich in imagery, and if you haven't read the Gospel of John, I think just for its literary value, it should be read. It is very powerful. Number 5 is the last of the 3 works on this list that are religious, and that's Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich, who was a 14th century anchorite. So the anchorites were nuns who locked themselves in their cell and never really left. While she was sick in her cell, she had a series of visions. And these visions are very Christological. They're focusing on Christ. I mean, sometimes, and I mentioned the fact that the crucifixion really fascinates me. There are some pretty graphic images of Jesus crucified in Revelations of Divine Love, so I feel like mentioning that. It was quite popular in the 14th century. It's what's known as Christ is wounded for you spirituality, with this emphasis on Christ being wounded and like the spiritual significance of that. So if that's not something that appeals to you, you might want to skip that portion. But there are other sections that do not describe that. There's a lot of emphasis on hope and on grace and even feminine images of God. She is the first author I ever read who described God in feminine terms, comparing even Jesus to a mother. So I thought it was really, really beautiful, and it's one that I return to frequently. Alright, we're almost at the top 3, but number 4 is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I have read this book probably 4 or 5 times now, and even though it was difficult the first time I read it because it is written in that typical stream of consciousness style that Virginia Woolf is known for, there are scenes that come back to me over and over again, and the film adaptation is also quite good. I'm not always very into experimental prose, but Virginia Woolf is able to communicate something through that style, through this experimental stream of consciousness style, that she wouldn't have been able to communicate otherwise. And Mrs. Dalloway, we follow this woman, Mrs. Dalloway, who during the course of one day is preparing for a party that is being held at her place, and the Prime Minister will arrive. And then alongside that, we have the story of a man Septimus, who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And just the way that it's told, I felt so close to all of the characters. Even Mrs. Dalloway and how selfish she is. I even cared about her. I even cared about Miss Kilman, who is this religious fanatic who is quite selfish as well, and yet I could connect with her. It's very quiet, it is difficult to plow through, but this is a book you'll want to revisit. I feel like with Woolf, the first time you read any of her works, you get a lot out of it, but you get more out of it, way more out of it, the second and third time you read it. Number 3 is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. I have definitely mentioned Gulliver's Travels on here before and my love for it. The first time I read it was in 8th grade. Now, I wasn't assigned it, but the English teacher mentioned Gulliver's Travels in passing. If you've been following my blog, you know that my most recent post was about this English teacher and his influence on me in poetry. He was one of the most influential teachers in my intellectual development, and I am forever grateful to him for introducing me to so much great literature. Because when he mentioned Gulliver's Travels, I found the plot really appealing, and I went to the library, got the book, read it in 2 days. I was not a good English student, so it was difficult for me, and yet I enjoyed every page. I loved it. The satire was totally over my head. I couldn't follow what was going on at times, and yet I stuck with it. I loved how Gulliver is a giant among the Lilliputians, and then really tiny among the Brobdingnagians. We have talking horses, the Winhams. There are all kinds of islands. There's like a floating island, and I just loved it. And now I have probably read this book 5 or 6 times, and I will certainly be reading it this year again. I like to read it every couple years, and every time I get more out of it than the last time. In fact, the last time I read the book, I was so blown away by Swift's commentary in the 5th book, the Last Land, the Winhams chapter, that I knew that this book really did belong as one of my favorite books of all time. I have mentioned also that I really like travel narratives. The reason why I started reading Niels Klim's Underground Travels by Ludwig Holberg in Latin as my first book to read in Latin is because it was compared to Gulliver's Travels. So anything that's compared to Gulliver's Travels, I will definitely read. I think that travel narratives as social satires are just fun ways to really explore humanity. Number 2 is another travel narrative, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Moby Dick is a book that you either love or you don't love. I love the cetology chapters, cetology being the study of whales. The sections on whale anatomy are the best chapters in the book because they're not simply about whales. Some of the information in Moby Dick, maybe quite a lot of the scientific information in Moby Dick, are inaccurate. But Melville is using this information as imagery to explore Captain Ahab or Starbuck or any of the other characters, humanity. And I just think it's an incredible masterpiece. I love the experimentation with prose. And again, like with Virginia Woolf, it works in Moby Dick, whereas I didn't think, for example, it worked in Lincoln and the Bardo. It's definitely a book I want to reread. I've reread certain chapters, but I have never reread the entire book, despite it being number 2 on my list. And number 1, my favorite book of all time, is The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince, by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I did mention that recently. The Little Prince is my favorite book of all time. I, at one point, memorized multiple chapters of the book and would recite it to my French teacher at the end of class. That's how obsessed I was. I've read this book so many times. I do not think there is a wasted word. It's a children's book, and yet the second half is certainly not for children. It is a philosophical work. We get some references to Pascal in there, and I just think it's a masterpiece and a reminder that a book written for children, and it is dedicated to children, can be just as profound or even more profound than a book written for adults. So that's my list. Let me know if you've read any of these books, and I really want to thank Jason for creating this tag. I wasn't tagged, and I'm not going to tag any particular people. If you haven't done this tag, you should definitely do it. And I wanted to mention this because it is kind of relevant to this tag, even though it is kind of a shameless plug. So I created this tag, not the one that I just did, but I created a tag maybe last year, near when I started Booktube. And it's called the Commonplace Book Tag, and you just basically choose 3 literary quotes that are your favorites, and you just read them and then explain why they're your favorite quotes. And I thought I'd mention it here as something you might want to do alongside this tag, just because your top 3 favorite quotes probably come from one of the top 10 favorite books list, and you might want to share that. I have had a few booktubers who've done it, and it's been a really, really cool experience. So I will link that below as well. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.